Well, hello and good evening, everyone. Welcome to IAedChat Live. We are bringing you the latest educational news each month and very pleased to be able to connect with you tonight. As you can see, we have two very special guests this evening. Joining us are Tom Murray and Eric Sheninger. They are here and we will introduce them in just a few minutes. In the meantime, you can find Tom on Twitter at Thomas C. Murray, and you can find Eric at E_Sheninger. As you can see, tonight we're running a live video stream, and we will be taking questions from the audience. If you are interested, please submit your questions via our hashtag at #IAedChat. We will monitor this feed, so please don't hesitate to share your thoughts and your questions, and we will make sure that Tom and Eric answer them for you. And then we will get this show on our podcast later tonight. So if you have not checked us out on iTunes or Podomatic, do that. Subscribe to us and check us out. We are going to get going with some introductions. My name, I will start, is Dan Butler, and I am an elementary principal in Epworth, Iowa. And I'm going to kick it to Andrea.
Hey guys, Andrea Townsley, transitioning to a new position this summer, making a transition from instructional coach at Benton Community Schools, and I will be working at Grantwood AEA as a school improvement consultant.
Hi, everyone. My name is Colin Wicken. I am transitioning also to a new role. I will be the associate principal in charge of activity. Can you guys hear me? Okay. Associate principal in charge of activities at Bettendorf High School. And I will introduce our guests tonight, starting with Eric Sheninger. Eric is a senior fellow and thought leader on digital leadership with the International Center for Leadership Education. Prior to this, he was the award-winning principal at New Milford High School in New Milford, New Jersey. Under his leadership, his school became a globally recognized model for innovative practices. Eric oversaw the successful implementation of several sustainable change initiatives that radically transformed the learning culture at his school while increasing achievement. His work focuses on leading and learning in the digital age as a model for moving schools and districts forward. Eric is an internationally recognized keynote speaker and the author of several books, including Leading Transformed with co-author Tom Murray. That leads me into Tom's bio. Tom serves as the Director of Innovation for Future Ready Schools, a project of the Alliance Excellence Education located in Washington, D.C. Murray, as a regular conference keynote, was named the 2017 Education Thought Leader of the Year, one of 20 to watch by NSBA in 2016, and was named the Education Policy Person of the Year by the Academy of Arts and Science in 2015. His new book, Learning Transformed, co-authored with Eric Sheninger, was published and published by ASCD, was released in 2017. Murray's experiences in K-12 digital leadership, which include implementing a one-to-one program, BYOD, blending learning, and a K-12 cyber school, where he served as the Director of Technology and Cyber Education for the Quakertown Community School District in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, have been recognized nationally. A former school principal and teacher, Murray is passionate about proper digital learning implementation and personalized professional learning.
We'll give you a little time off now.
Take a break.
You have about 5 minutes.
You're not going to share any high school accomplishments, Colin? Come on.
Wow, I'm out of breath. I'm out of breath.
All right, well, that leads us into some questions. Don't forget, you guys that are watching us and joining us on Twitter, you can submit your questions for Eric and Tom, and we will give them your questions from the hashtag. So go ahead and give us a shout on our Twitter back channel, and we will ask them for you. So the first one we have tonight, I'm not sure which one of you guys, have you done paper, rock, scissors to decide who starts, but the first question we have is, talk to us about your background in education and what has brought you to where you are today.
I'll defer to Eric first. I'm feeling like a gentleman tonight.
All right. You know, I was not supposed to go in the field of education. My father was an elementary principal for 30 years. My mother, a first grade teacher. I said, I'm never going to go in education. Pursued a degree in marine biology and a master's in fisheries biology. And as I was snorkeling in streams in the middle of nowhere, Western Maryland, I was on a graduate teaching assistantship, and that's where I really found where my passion was. So I went back home, went to East Stroudsburg University, got my teacher certification, actually taught marine biology and coached football, ice hockey, lacrosse, taught a variety of science subjects. And when I was there, I wanted to do more for kids. So got my degree in administration. And from there, I ended up at New Milford High School, where I was the principal that did not believe in anything that I now talk about. I wrote the policies to block social media. I ran around taking devices from kids. I was on reality TV, not a very positive moment in my life. But that's when I sort of had my epiphany where, a student told me my school was like a jail and really explained to me what I could be doing better. Then I got on Twitter, created a personal learning network, learned how much I did not know. And from that point in 2009, we began to transform our school. 5 years later, after improving achievement across the board and becoming a model for innovative practices, hosting visits from all over the world, I left the principalship to my new role as senior fellow. So, with me not believing, then believing, and working with an amazing staff and group of students that really felt that we could be better. And not only better, but we're able to align evidence and show efficacy in our work. And that sort of brought me to where I am today now, having the honor of working with schools, districts all over the world to help with their digital transformation efforts.
And hey, everybody, Tom here. I'll share on my end. After my dream of being a professional athlete was shattered in high school, I decided I wanted to go pre-med, and I loved working with kids. I did a lot of things growing up with children, and I just always had this, honestly, a desire to give back to kids, and just feeling very fortunate and truly privileged in having a solid home that I would go home to every day. I recognized that not every child had that. And so even when I was younger, I knew I wanted to work with kids, but I ended up going to college thinking I wanted to be pre-med. I wanted to be a pediatrician, and I started off at Muhlenberg College, about 45 minutes south of where Eric went to school. And that's what I thought I wanted to do. And then about a semester or two in, I realized, I didn't want to just see kids when they were sick every day. I wanted to actually get to know them and see their growth. So I actually moved over to education, and then actually spent 15 years, as you read in the bio there, in public schools here in Pennsylvania before going to work in DC. And like Eric, I think my educational career truly changed when I did also get connected, and I could learn from people like Eric online or through people around the world. And for me, that became real when I was a tech director. We were rolling out one-to-one, and this is going back a good 7 or 8 years ago. We were doing a lot of things that were very different. We were creating our own online cyber courses inside of our public school for kids to take. And I was really reaching out across the country of who else had gone before me, who had done that work, or what were areas of places that were trying to do similar work, and how can I connect with those people to, number one, learn so I don't make the same mistakes that they made, and how do I learn from them, but also how do I use them as resources, and then also give back and benefit from my own understanding and those things there as well. And so fast forward a number of years, my job in Washington, D.C. now entails national work from coast to coast and the opportunity to work with school leaders across the country. I also get to work with awesome organizations like Eric's, and ICLE is one of the premier organizations when it comes to getting this work done and actually showing the growth in schools and helping schools through, whether it's through coaching or leadership type training. But then on our end, running all of our Future Ready work. And I'd love for anybody online tonight to check out futureready.org. All the work that we do through Future Ready is completely free. It is completely grant funded. And it gives me the opportunity to work with school leaders from coast to coast on a weekly basis. And that is incredibly rewarding. I will say I do miss the days of being an elementary principal and going to hang out in kindergarten when I'm having a rough day. But at the same time, being able to work with school leaders like yourselves across the country on a weekly basis is amazingly rewarding. And so it's brought me to where I am to date. I've been blessed with a lot of incredible experiences, but so much of that has come from people like you all on this Google Hangout tonight, but also people that are watching the chat that I've been able to learn from and grow from as well moving forward.
Awesome stuff, guys. As you can see, everybody, we've got two just dynamic superstars with us that are going to give us all kinds of information, knowledge with their journey through this work. And let's get it going. So both of you spent a whole lot of time researching and implementing personalized learning efforts all around the globe. So if you could, don't care who goes first, you can fight over it. But what does personalized learning mean to you?
I'll let Tom go this first this time.
You feel like a gentleman tonight.
You guys
This
are
is
so
good.
nice.
This
I
is
mean,
good.
seriously, come on.
Wait for 60 minutes from now, Now, so what's really interesting is throughout the book, we actually wrote about learning that's personal. One of the things that's out there right now on social media, you'll see some debate about is it personal learning or is it personalized learning? And typically when people, and I'm generalizing here, are referring to personalized learning, they're often referring to things that are a bit more tech heavy, learning pathways on computers, things where you're using adaptive type software related to that. For us, we were really looking at learning that's personal and authentic to kids. And I think you can go a variety of ways. It wasn't our job as we wrote Learning Transformed to depict here's exactly what learning has to look like in your district. That is not our mantra. Our mantra is very much is how do we make it personal and relevant for kids? We contrast that with really a system that we probably all grew up under. Very much teacher-centric environment, desks in rows, very little talk time for kids, very much teacher-driven, regurgitation-based. And I think for the most part, we can probably all relate to that. Any of the data, any of the research that's out there really shows that's completely ineffective. Any of the brain science aspects that you look at, how do we make it more personal? When we think about our own experiences, we look back on our careers, or even today, we look at what's personal for us in our own professional learning experiences. How do we create those types of experiences? One of the topics Eric often talks on is awe, and I love his keynote on awe and bringing awe back to learning. How do we bring that awe back to learning for kids where they leave? Here we've got, Dan, we've got kids coming to the very first day of school coming up in just a few weeks for many of our districts around the country. What is it that's going to bring them back to day 2? If all we are is we're filling out the index cards, handing out the books, telling them they're number 16, and that's the gist of day 1, God help us if that kid's going home being like, yeah, really can't wait for day 2. Why don't we use day 1 for authentic experiences? If I'm the chemistry teacher, why don't I just start blowing stuff up on day 1? If I'm the bio teacher, let's just start dissecting things day 1, or the phys ed teacher, getting them running around. How do we make sure that those types of experiences are the norm and not the exception in that case? And so when we looked at data, when we looked at the various things across the country in terms of data, we have to redesign that learning experience. And for us, that personal, we used personal again, not necessarily personalized, and we contrast that in the book. What does it mean to me, for myself, ultimately, to get to the question that you truly asked there, is how do we take students' interests, students' passions, students' incredible genius and unique abilities, regardless of where they are, regardless of their levels, and how do we leverage those to connect to dynamic content, to reach high standards, so that way they can ultimately have a world full of possibilities and potential? Too many times we focus on the negative side of the gap where kids are, as opposed to the positive side of the potential and the skills that they do have. And so how do we use their interests, their abilities, their passions, and where they are to truly ignite a fire so that they can truly become what they really want to become moving forward?
Well, Tom did not leave me much wiggle room to add my commentary, but I'm going to. And, he really hit the nail on the head. We really focus more on personal learning. And let's talk about what personalized is not. It is not contingent upon a technology tool. We see so many districts invest tons of money into a platform. And it's a platform that really is driving the experience for our kids, when it should be the opposite. So whether we call it personalized or personal, to us, it's moving away from the what. It's not about what we teach. It's not about what's in the curriculum. It's not about what's on the test. That does not matter to the kids. So it's that shift from what to who, to emphasize a personalized, more personal approach for our kids. Because it has to be about the who is our kids. Do they understand why they're learning what they're learning? Why it's important to them? How it's going to prepare them for their future? And then finally, what tools they are going to be able to use to support their learning. So when we look at personalized approaches, and again, with and without technology, that's our school policies, our structures that are designed to treat kids as unique individuals. And then on the personal side, that's what happens in our classrooms. That's the important role of our teachers, our learning spaces, and other authentic activities that our kids engage in. It's those learning experiences that empower kids to own their learning. They're thinking, they're being creative, they're exploring. It's about student agency, choice, voice, and advocacy. So I think we have to be careful when we hear the term personalized, because we want to go down that rabbit hole and really just latch on to a platform. when it's anything about that. It really comes back to our students and what are their passions, as Tom mentioned, what do they want to learn about, and do they see the value? And are we preparing our kids to be the next generation of thinkers, doers, inventors, and creators where they're in the driver's seat of their learning?
Dan, one of the interesting things to jump back in there, one of the questions that I've often asked, and Eric and I asked when we run workshops around Learning Transformed, is we often have educators reflect on two aspects. Number one, what is the best professional learning experience you've ever experienced and why? What are the characteristics? And then the second piece is, what is the worst that you've ever experienced and why? And typically people have some fun with that. People, hey, I went to that training too 5 years ago. But you know what it gets down to when we start to reflect and we bring it back? It's the same experiences that we often see in the classroom. And when we talk about learning that's personal, people start to bring that out from their own professional learning. When we ask from coast to coast, truly thousands of people that we've asked these questions to, what it often comes down to is learning that's relevant for me, things that are applicable for me, things that I can do tomorrow in my classroom, different areas that I can take from what I've learned and I can apply them. Those are the types of experiences that if it's working for us as educators because it's personal, well, we need to do the same thing for kids. We can't expect that the things that are working for us as educators that are really personal for us, that seem to be working for professional learning in the ways that we're growing, well, if it works for us, why wouldn't it work for kids? And the flip side is also true. And so I think professional learning is really a microcosm of that question. And people across the country are saying what's working for them to grow professionally is when things are personal. So in the same facet, from a curriculum and instruction end with teaching and learning for our kids, we've got to do the same thing for them. For what we coined in our book, the Netflix generation of kids, where they've got content on demand anytime, anywhere, the moment they want it. For us to remain relevant in our schools, we have to utilize a more personal approach so that they see the value and the relevance in the work that we're doing every day.
Fantastic. Thanks for such a thorough answer on that, guys. And we're going to dig into the book a little bit, your Learning Transformed book, and I'm going to kick it over to Colin to ask the next one for you. And one thing before he jumps in, the followers online here, be sure to ask your questions through our hashtag of IAedChat. We're continuing to monitor that. If you've got questions for Eric and Tom, throw them in there and we will get them asked for you.
Yeah, thanks, guys. What great and thorough answers, more so than we even planned on. So filling up to the hype. So 2 months ago, you guys released a book, Transform Learning, 8 Keys to Designing Tomorrow's School Today. Give our listeners a brief overview of this book and what inspired you guys to write it.
I think I will tackle what inspired us to write it. And if Tom's okay with it, I'll let him tackle that first question. I think when many of us changed and we began to, in our respective roles, embrace different and better, and I'll be honest, I didn't really look too carefully at the research that was out there to guide my work, which I'm not saying you have to, but I did not. And, there wasn't really those exemplars that could show efficacy in their work. And I think efficacy is that word that I know when Tom and I discussed why we want to write this book. It's like, we need to show efficacy. We need, if we can, to give more support to leaders and teachers to focus on dealing with the naysayers and the antagonists, provide a research base, and then really show those schools and districts and educators that are taking action to really implement change that's sustainable and that has substance. And that's the rationale. As Tom and I, as I was going through my work at New Milford, I'm thinking, there's got to be more research here, because I want more people to change. And I understand that with mindsets, we need to really provide that rationale. People, not just our kids, they need to understand the why and the how. So the inspiration to write this book was pretty simple. Our goal was twofold. Let's show everyone that there is a vast research base that guides our work. There is so much talk right now, and I'm just going to be very honest. On social media, there's so much talk about all this great stuff. We wanted to take the talk and show educators how we can actually implement it, aligned to research, and then not only the research component, but the schools and districts that have taken the research to improve results for kids. whether we're looking at, bridging the digital divide, improving the achievement gap, ensuring equity. Our goal was, how can we provide a research that tackles all those elements? And we just thought about, what did we need as school leaders that could more help us implementing sustainable change? And that's the reason why we actually got together to write this book.
So the other piece that I'll add to that, Eric and I have the fortunate opportunity to work with school leaders across the country, and for the past number of years, we've seen a variety of issues that have really started to come up. So many times, Eric and I were working with principals, district office staff, and superintendents. And to Eric's point about the research and the evidence, many times the superintendents that we're working with have to stand before a school board, asking them for hundreds of thousands, if not sometimes millions of dollars, and they can't just stand up there and say, like, well, we think it might be a good idea, and so maybe we should spend this $1 million in taxpayer money. They need the evidence. They need to show, well, here's other places that have done it. This is the research as to why that we're doing it. And so part of it is we really wanted to arm school leaders with a handbook, so to say, and that was Sir Ken Robinson's word related to our book, a handbook for change in so many different areas. The other piece is, in working with so many places around the country, is that we've seen many places doing many, many really good things, but you forget about one aspect. You forget about community. You forget about something like privacy. You forget about something like, personalized professional learning and how to make it relevant. And the whole thing can fall apart. And so how do we make sure that we use evidence-based approaches to arm school leaders with the tools that they need in that regard? But then also, like Eric started to say, show them what actually worked. And Eric and I are both longtime practitioners, but we didn't want it to just be our stories and about us. We wanted to highlight and showcase the amazing things that are happening around the country. And that's something Eric and I are very fortunate to be able to see on a weekly basis from coast to coast. However, in the same sense, I know when he puts himself back in New Milford, or I put myself back in Pennsylvania, our scope was relatively limited into the amazing things that were going on there. Let's face it, there's been amazingly innovative things going around in our schools for decades. Teachers by themselves have done incredible things in classrooms because they're amazingly talented and they're incredible people. So how do we, number one, on our end, scale that work so these incredibly innovative practices are not in pockets, they are the norm and not the exception? But then how do we also highlight the amazing things that are going on around there? So every one of our chapters actually ends with what we call an IPA. It is not the beer. It's an innovative practice and action to show them from their own words. And you hear from superintendents of the year. You hear from principals of the year, the CIO of the year last year. You hear their stories. Here's the issues that we faced in our district in Virginia, in Washington, and wherever the case might be. Here's how we overcame those issues. And this is where we're going with all this work. And so it's not, Learning Transformed is not just the story about Eric and I and the work that we've done. It is not that at all. We share stories. We share things that we went through. It is far more about, here's success stories around the country. This is how they overcame adversity. This is how they worked through things like home access for kids that didn't have them in high-performing and high-need districts. We also, Eric mentioned very briefly, this notion of equity. One of our moral imperatives in the book, and we reference it right in the very beginning, is this notion of equity throughout. Eric and I, as you can see in this Google Hangout, are two white males having this conversation regarding this book. We wanted to make sure that every single child, whether it's a child of color, or we both have daughters that are females in these areas, have every opportunity that we both had growing up in New Jersey and for me, New York. And so when we took a look at those pieces, we wanted to make sure that it was absolutely evidence-based, but also highlighting the amazing things. I think we tell probably close to 20 stories. And when I say we tell, I should actually give credit to the authors, the people from around the country that have been sharing their work and their stories. But then also, how do we leverage that so that it's for all children, whether it's in the deepest areas of some of our poorest states, or it's in some of the highest flying areas and things they're doing as well. And so you hear stories that are urban, that are rural, that are large districts, that are small districts, from coast to coast, to be able to highlight the amazing things that educators are doing around the country. Number one, to inspire educators to continue to march forward. Number two, to arm leaders with, hey, these are things that are working. This isn't just pie in the sky. These are things that are working. And also, here's the evidence to support your transformation and the why you want to do what you want to do. So it really does become, our goal was to become a handbook for change. And with that, I say, not that there's one silver bullet or one correct way to do it, but here's so many of the large bucket issues that you have to deal with moving forward. Here's the evidence to support that transformation moving forward. And here's success stories to help you guide the way.
And my final word on that, I'll just be blunt. We have to start looking past the fluff. if we really want to transform our schools at scale. And that really brings it full circle to what we are trying to do is, not get sucked down that rabbit hole where this stuff sounds great in theory, but in practice, it's just not as easy as it sounds.
Guys, there are some awesome things coming out of this conversation, and I know some of our viewers are getting excited hearing about the book. We've had some questions on Twitter, so I'm going to start with one. Jason Steingraber says, what are some ways you've pushed fear out of your systems?
Well, I think, the getting rid of fear, I love this quote by Zig Ziglar. You can either forget everything and run, or face everything and rise. So it's how you shift your mindset to look at fear. And I think the best way to make people more willing to take those risks and not be afraid is that, leadership 101, modeling. Don't ask others to do what you're not willing to do yourself, or don't ask others to do what you have not done yourself. And I think that if we put ourselves out there and, we think forward, that we're, learning to do, doing to learn, everything that we talk about. I think as leaders, we have to, again, excuse a cliche, not just talk the talk, but walk the walk. I think we have to create the conditions, and we talk a lot about that in our book about leadership. How do we create the conditions where we grant autonomy, where we're flexible, where, we look at failure as a first attempt at learning, where we pursue innovation, not just for the sake of saying things are new and better, but I'm able to hold people accountable, not to get rid of or fire, but to grow and get better. And that accountability should lead to efficacy. So I think when we get rid of getting rid of fear is, are we learning together as a community? As administrators, are we learning with our staff? Are we being vulnerable? Are we explaining and discussing how it's okay not to have all the answers, but let's go find them? And I think that once we're successful, the best way to counteract fear is success. Success breeds success. And what we need to do is we got to showcase those successes at scale, whether it's in our classrooms, our schools, our districts. We talk about the importance of community building and branding and sharing and talking about our successes. The best way then to get rid of fear is, hey, when we have even those little wins, those big wins, doesn't matter. Let's share, let's learn together, and let's understand that everything's not always going to work out.
So the other aspect that I'll add to that, in our first key of learning transformed, and it does come out of the research base again, is that we note that leadership and school culture lay the foundation. You see, and Eric and I have worked with so many different schools that we can also personally attribute to in toxic school environments or environments that admin are ruling by fear. Innovation just isn't going to happen at scale. You'll get pockets of things happening in classrooms because teachers will find a way to do great things. But you have to also look at, where does that fear stem from? That fear comes from what? And I think part of it is, I think educators by themselves are wired to want to do things well. And so I also think that many times when we're asking them to change and to facilitate sometimes a change, we often put educators and teachers in particular here in a position where we say to them, you can't do it the way you've always done it. Yet we often don't show them what we were expecting it to actually look like. And so it creates this notion of where we're asking them to change, but not really showing them the possibilities of it. And that puts them at a really disadvantage. And I think the fear side of that comes in is they want to naturally do a good job, but yet we're not really showing them that end goal or that model or that example, yet telling them we can't do it the way they've always done it. So I think that naturally causes a fear inside of them, of that fear of failure, in that they know how they've been comfortable doing it. Now we're asking them to change. And so for me, that really comes down to leadership and school culture. And I know that's easy to say as somebody that works with leaders. If I'm a teacher watching this and saying, well, yeah, if I could magically flip the switch to turn my leadership on and create a culture that it would work, that'd be all said and done. And so to address those that may have fears, I would also say that, you know, that's a real thing. I mean, I can certainly relate to a time of, you know, working maybe in a building where I was often fearful to go to a principal or fearful to say, hey, I want to try something new. But what can you do? And part of that comes to culture. And when we look at cultures of buildings, you know, so much, again, research on relationships and culture will certainly point to that. And I would say, and Eric and I certainly hit this throughout the book, that every single person listening to this chat that's an educator in the building that they're in plays a role with culture. You know, so many times we just put the tone, or we just point the finger to somebody like a principal or a school leader. The amount of times that I'll hear, you know, 49 people complaining about one person. Like, what if those 49 people stepped up and did amazing things for kids every day to create a culture in their school, even if that one person, so to say, is a knucklehead? Those 49 people can absolutely make a difference. And I don't care if you're a custodian or a support staff member or a teacher, every one of you either builds culture on a daily basis or tears it down on a daily basis, one step at a time. And so what can you do? You can help build that culture of trust, because when there is that culture of trust, when there's that culture of risk taking, that fear starts to subside. And I know Eric and I could tell story after story of times that we totally screwed it up. Things that we went in, we had lessons that were fun. We thought were going to be phenomenal, and they were a disaster. But our leadership, and I can think of many of my stories where my leadership didn't rip my heart out. They built me up, and they didn't reaffirm the negative, but they built me up and said, you know, yeah, that didn't go so well. Let's try this again. Let's co-plan this. Let's co-teach this. I've had principals say that as well. And those types of things can help fear to go down. In fear cultures, innovation will not thrive. And nor is it fair to ask teachers to step outside of the box if we are ruling by fear in that regard as well.
All right, you hit a little bit on my next question, so I'm going to bounce back over to Twitter. Michael Shenison asks you a question. What's your biggest issue that you see when schools struggle with becoming future-ready schools?
That's I'll take that one because future ready is kind of my home. That's a pretty broad question. I would say it's very difficult for me to generalize that, because I think it's important that we recognize that every school culture, every school is different, every school is unique, every community is different, every community is unique. So let me take a little bit of the easy way out. Let me highlight a handful of areas that schools may be struggling with. Does that sound all right, Andrea? To generalize on the issue is really, it's too broad of a question to answer in a way that would actually do any relevance for the good of the whole. So let me hit a variety of issues. One of the areas that schools have been struggling with, but actually has made a significant gain in the past 8 to 10 years, is this notion of connectivity. As we're trying to do a lot more for things for kids, as we're working in ways to make learning more personal, as we're trying to leverage different tools and things in the classroom, this notion of connectivity has been an issue. However, because of things like E-rate modernization, because of valuing at it all the way up from the White House level over the past number of years to the classroom, connectivity in schools has gotten a lot better. But let me flip that. One of the things that remains an issue that districts are working through, and honestly, some districts don't have it on their radar yet, but they need to, is this notion of things like connectivity at home. We're doing all this digital stuff quite often in schools, yet the Pew Research shows, and this is something we talk about in Learning Transformed, that about 5 million of the nation's families, now there's about 26 million families with kids in schools in the United States, about 5 million of our nation's families lose connectivity the moment those kids go home. So one of the issues that they're dealing with is, what do we do for those kids? You know, we can do all this digital stuff, all these digital tools, we can do all this social media, yet if I'm the kid that goes home and doesn't have access, and my teachers don't even realize that, and then I'm asking them to do this because, by the way, 70%, that's another statistic, about 70% of our nation's teachers are asking kids to do something digital outside of school. And so if I'm one of the kids that doesn't have access in your community, and you're asking me to do something digital outside of school, well, what about me? Like, that can put me in a severe disadvantage. And I've never met a kid that wants to put their hand up and say, like, I'm sorry, like, I can't access what you're asking me to do tonight. And yet, how many times the next day does a teacher go and get in that kid's face of, this is your responsibility in the real world, you're not going to get a second chance, and has no idea that they asked them to do something the night before they didn't have access to. But when we talk about future ready schools, one of the stories that we actually share as well in Learning Transformed comes from a superintendent of the year, Russell Booker in South Carolina, how our district's overcoming issues like that, because when we talk about future ready schools, it is this notion of problem solving, not complaining about every issue. How do we tackle that issue? So what Russell and his team, I'll just take that example, what they're doing in South Carolina, 7 Ignites, it's the number 7, and then ignites.com is the site that I'm about to refer to. So they're working with their community. We talk about community collaboration in one of our chapters to highlight all the places in their community where kids can get free access to Wi-Fi. And they're actually asking their businesses, hey, will you put on a guest network that our kids are welcome to hop onto? And then they're highlighting at school all the areas in their community that kids are welcome to go if they don't have connectivity. And so what we love about school leaders is they're problem solvers. What we love about school leaders is also recognizing, we got to stop admiring problems year after year after year. We've got to start tackling them. And so that's one example of an area that districts are struggling with that are also now problem solving, because that's a very real issue for 5 million of our nation's families. So I'll just hit that one for now.
And my 10 cents is saying you're future ready and signing a pledge is totally different than showing how you're meeting the expectations aligned to the gears of the future ready framework, how you're showing the evidence that teaching, learning, and leadership is actually changing, resulting in efficacy. And I know I used that word before, but signing a pledge is easy. Yeah, we want to get people geared up, but Tom will be the first one to agree. Once you sign the pledge, that's great. But how are you going to begin to transform learning? What are you going to do to create new pathways of learning? How are you going to transform your professional development? How are you going to build your infrastructure? How are you going to make sure that your pedagogy changes? Most importantly, that your assessment changes. How are you going to show how you're engaging with communities? I mean, it goes beyond. Again, what I said before, so when we talk about future ready, the key is, all right, well, let's put all of the changes on the table. And let's talk about where we are. And I think we have to talk more about that, because where are we at? But more importantly, where do we want to be? And then creating that plan on how we're going to get there. So, again, I'm not taking away from any district that signed a future ready pledge, but it is the rolling up the sleeves, the hard work to make sure that we're actually changing our practice to create future ready schools, districts that can prepare kids for their future.
Yeah, just to jump in there again, I couldn't agree more with what Eric said. We've had over 3,100 superintendents across the nation sign the Future Ready Pledge, and it hits many of the areas that Eric just hit there as well. But I'll be the very first in doing that work on a day-to-day basis to say that, signing the pledge doesn't change the district itself. What it does is it allows superintendents, which are a vital component to this, to stand up and say, we believe in these things. These are areas that we are working towards. That's what it does. However, it doesn't change things overnight. Unfortunately, there's groups like Eric's through ICLE and places like that that are supporting districts on a day-to-day basis through coaching and through leadership coaching and those types of things too, to help them move forward. Eric also referenced the Future Ready framework, and there's a lot of great tools and resources. You see, Future Ready actually comes from over 60 organizations like ICLE and Eric's group, but organizations like AASA for superintendents, or NAESP, NASSP for principals, and I could go on ISTE and COSTN and so on and so forth, to leverage the tools and resources to come together to support the transformation moving forward. And again, we encourage people to check that out at futureready.org. There is no cost. There is no sales pitch. It is all grant funded and funded in different ways to support districts moving forward. So thanks for the shout on that, Eric. And I certainly encourage district leaders to check that out.
Thank you for talking about that. That Future Ready is something definitely worth investigating. And those free resources, we put a link on the hashtag. So definitely go ahead and check that out. CJ Kane asked a question, but I do think Dan's going to ask the next question. But I think your question, CJ, about advice looking for districts looking to transform will be answered in the next question. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Dan.
Sure. So let's dig in a little bit. So one of the keys in the book you guys write about is that educational decisions must be grounded in evidence and driven by a return on instruction. Would you guys take a few minutes to explain a little bit deeper this ROI, as you refer to it?
Yeah, I mean, that it sort of materialized in the work that we were doing in New Milford High School. And it came down to early on when we were all in. We're doing the PLNs, we're talking about innovation, we're going bring your own device, all this great stuff. And my superintendent said, hey, Eric, the board and I would like to know what evidence do you have that it's actually improving anything? And it's something that a lot of people don't, I'm going to be honest, they don't want to talk about. And that's another reason why we wrote the book, because we do have to talk about it, because evidence does matter. So it made me pause and reflect. And from that on, when we looked at this return on instruction, we broke it down into 4 main categories. What is our data telling us? How are we improving observation and evaluation? Do we actually know what's going on in our classrooms? Artifacts. Are we looking at how assessment's changing? Are we looking at student work? Is it aligned to standards? Are we looking at unit plans, lesson plans? Are we really looking at technology being used in ways to have kids learn that they couldn't without the technology? You know, and as how are kids grasping, you know, concepts while demonstrating high levels of cognitive thought and relevance? And finally, portfolios. You know, are we looking at growth over time aligned to standards, whether it be student portfolios, teacher portfolios, administrator portfolios? So, you know, everyone talks about evidence and being data. It doesn't have to be data. We have to change the conversation about how we can, again, show efficacy in our work beyond the standardized data that our stakeholders want. So when we talk about changes to teaching, learning, and leadership, ROI is about showing that evidence. And it's about looking at, you know, we had one student who created this amazing project. We talk about agency. Well, here it wasn't action. Kids were able to select the right tool for the right task. They were able to use their voice to talk about why creativity mattered to them. They read books by Sir Ken Robinson. They created a product aligned, in our case at the time, the Common Core Standards, New Jersey Core Curriculum Content Standards, and they created an artifact where they pushed it out to the whole world. Not only was it aligned to standards, not only could we see that that student was being prepared for what they were going to eventually be tested on Park in our case, but Sir Ken Robinson himself reached out to our student after seeing the project on Twitter, commented on it, and shared it. So there's different ways that we can show return on instruction, but we have to, again, be more willing to share our assessments, share our projects, show how it's aligned to standards, show, whether we like it or not, how we're still preparing kids for the standardized assessments that they're going to take. Because that is a reality for every single one of you that are on this Google Hangout right now, and virtually everyone else that is watching. So with the ROI, it's about how do we pair the data and results that our communities want, but also show how innovative practices can be used in conjunction with that to help us achieve our goals.
So let me give a couple of other concrete examples, and I agree with certainly with everything that Eric just said. One of the things that we talk about in the book in this area also notes to, like, let's take for the technology. You know, I think when Eric and I look at that nationally or following, you know, we often get lumped into, you know, ed tech people for ed tech this or ed tech blogs. You know, ed tech is one of those areas that we tackle in the book, because when we look at technology, let me give you a couple pieces of perspective here. When you look nationally for the past decade or so, school budgets have remained relatively stagnant. They've gotten a little bit better in the past couple of years. However, ed tech spending has truly gone through the roof. Like as budgets have remained relatively stagnant, ed tech spending has gone up exponentially in that regard and continues to climb. Part of it is this notion that I think that this mindset of just because it's technology in schools, some of it's this mindset that it's actually doing anything or any good. And that's a that we call that the ed tech fallacy in our book. The other piece related to that is that, you know, you can take things like, let's take some of the latest bandwagons. We can take 3D printers, we can take maker spaces, we can take coding and robots and all those things. And people are like, oh God, what's Tom going to say? Hear me out for a minute. Something like a 3D printer can absolutely help create a very personal, authentic, dynamic learning experience for kids. Or it can be a colossal waste of money. Just because, and I'll give you a quick example of that. You know, we walk the little first graders down to the library. We would hear come the little ducklings, and they all sit, and for 42 minutes we hear bzzz, and they're printing this tiny little duck. And 42 minutes later, we hold up this little duck, and we're like, hey, we're 3D printing, and we put it out there on social media, and all the little first graders are clapping their hands, and they learned nothing in the process, with the exception of the 10-second lesson of this little 3D printer can print something. Thanks, we're done. That is not how technology can be used effectively. That is not a ROI. That money spent on those types of things is honestly a total waste. You see, something like a Chromebook, something like a MacBook Pro can be an amazing tool. We call it, can be a pathway to unleash student genius, or a total waste of money if it's a digital worksheet storage hub. It's not the device's fault how it's used. It's not the 3D printer's fault how it's used. You see, that 3D printer, I think about something like the hand challenge being done by Chris Kraft and kids down in South Carolina. They're printing 3D hands for kids around the world. You see, that's taking the tools you have, creating an authentic and personal experience for kids, and changing the lives of others in the process. That's far different than the exact same device printing a duck that we downloaded the instructions online and we're just letting kids watch it print. I mean, if that's how we're using technology, shame is us on the professionals. If we're just using the robots to drive them around on the iPad, like I drove a remote control car 30 years ago. There's no learning in that. Yet if we're doing the science and the computer science and the coding related to it, well, that's a different story. Because sometimes what we're doing is we're skipping the race, the learning side, and we're jumping right to the finish line and celebrating that we ran the race when all we did was get to the finish line. And if we're jumping the learning in the process of tech, we're really just wasting money. And so one of the examples related to ROI, as we have purchased more and more educational technology than ever before, is it actually doing anything? One of the stories that we tell in the book is my very last board meeting. And I always have to clarify, like, I didn't get canned. I was actually already going to my role in DC. My school board president, it was the budget meeting. My school board looked at me and said, so Tom, if we're going to spend this additional X amount of dollars in technology for next year, an increase. And, you know, we could debate, is he talking about test scores and why shouldn't it be test scores? Like, that's not what he was getting at. Here's somebody that's the president of the school board. In other words, they signed the taxpayer money over. And what they were essentially asking is, hey, if we're going to invest a lot of this money that's coming from the community, is it actually going to do anything? And you know what? We've got to ask that question more often. We've got to ask that question of, okay, if we're going to invest this money, like, what's the expected outcomes? How do we know it's working? What's going to be the metrics of success? As opposed to taking the technology like we're doing, buying it, putting it out there, putting it in carts, putting it in hallways, having 5,000 Chromebooks or whatever. And by the way, Chromebooks and iPads are great devices. It is not a knock on them. But putting it out there and essentially saying, like, now what do we do? Is it going to do anything? And so we've got to get to this notion of what's the return on instruction? How is it actually benefiting? Because in an effort where in one of our last chapters focuses on sustainability, you know, I've never worked with a district, and I'm guessing Eric hasn't either, where, you know, that we get in there and they're like, Tom, we've got so much money, we don't know what to do with it. You know, as things get tighter and tighter, as things get harder and harder for public schools across the board, we have to focus on a return on instruction to make sure that the money that we're spending is grounded in evidence, it's being used well, and it's not just being purchased for fluff to show on social media that, hey, we're doing all this great stuff, because at the end of the day, if it's not changing learning, it doesn't matter. And we've got to stop wasting money on stuff that isn't redefining the learning experience or supporting the learning experience. Just because we're one-to-one in a classroom doesn't mean it's doing anything. One-to-one is great. Trust me, we are advocates for all of this stuff, but when it's used well, not when it's a colossal waste of money.
Awesome stuff, guys. I love the evidence factor that you guys are talking about so passionately. And folks in the audience, if you have not checked out Learning Transformed 8 Keys, do that. They have a hashtag. It's hashtag LT8Keys. All kinds of great resources there. And then, of course, their book, get it on Amazon, Learning Transformed 8 Keys to Designing Tomorrow's Schools Today. Awesome stuff that you guys are digging into. We're winding down here, boys. You guys like to talk passionately, which is awesome. Fantastic. But I'm going to kick it to Colin. He's got another question for you.
Hey, gentlemen, I read a bio that I think took 10 minutes of the first start, and I haven't said a thing since. So no, great stuff. I appreciate all your experience and everything you guys have to put on the table. But this is connection with what you talked about in terms of personalizing the learning experience and modeling and you know, as a leader, just showing what you expect. Talk to me about learning spaces. I think we all feel that they have a potential to be maximized in a whole different potential. So tell me a little about your thoughts on this.
So I'm going to start, and then I'm going to turn over to Tom, because he really, I mean, his insight really drove that chapter in the book. But, you know, research has shown that the classroom design can impact learning by as much as 25%, positive or negative. Now, when I read that research study a few years ago, it really got me thinking, well, how do we have researched influenced learning spaces? And this study looked at everything from furniture, layout, color, acoustics, temperature. And the driving question that we thought about is, would we as adults want to learn under the same conditions as our kids? And conditions are twofold. It's the space and the pedagogy. You could have the best technology, the best pedagogy. Does the space help support and enhance those elements, and vice versa? But as we started looking at that one study, and Tom and I were really working on that chapter, we found numerous studies that looked at the research behind how classroom design can improve outcomes for kids. Last weekend, I pulled a post from our book where I highlighted, I believe, 6 or 7 individual studies. And, you know, Tom can basically improve this quote that we share a lot. You know, we have to look beyond Pinterest pretty classrooms and base our decisions on research and design thinking to create spaces that are actually going to improve learning for our kids.
So to jump in there on the topic, the first thing I'll admit is my first number of years as a teacher, I totally failed in this area. And this is not something that I understood, that I had a clue that there was research out there. I created my classroom for me. Like, I didn't create it for the kids. I created it for me. You know, one of the things that's fascinating is go to the average, and I'm going to pick on secondary here for a moment. Go to the average high school. Ask them what the skills are that kids are leaving with. And, you know, you'll hear, well, we're problem solving, collaborating, critical thinking, 21st century skills. By the way, this year, every one of our kids will have been born this century, just like side note. But anyway, so take all those skills, but then walk into the average classroom. If we're going to really be doing problem solving, critical thinking, collaboration, how is it that the norm can still be teacher-centric, standing up front, desks and rows? Like, those two things are completely at opposite ends. Let me be really clear here. Our chapter on learning spaces is not about what Eric started to say. This is not about being pretty for Pinterest. We're seeing a lot of that out there, that like, oh, look how I decorated my classrooms. Decorating your classroom has nothing to do with learning spaces. Because when it comes from a learning space end, we're talking about the brain research behind the environment in which you're learning in. What's fascinating also is sometimes, and again, with administrators, the moment we mention learning space redesign, and I get it, Eric and I have been signing the POs in our past too, they instantly think about money and finance, and we don't have the money to do this. So Eric and I were really cognizant of that. It's not the, well, gee, just go buy build a brand new building, spend millions of dollars on brand new flexible furniture, and you solved all your problems. Well, like, that might work for the 1% of cases where that's going to be a feasibility in the coming couple of years. What about everybody else? So we grounded it in the evidence and the research on things such as color and design and daylight and temperature and all these different aspects of what does it actually say. Again, things I was completely ignorant when I originally taught and was creating the environment for me. So what we did is we worked really through, like many of our chapters, we went from research to the practice, down also into what's a district like in Elizabeth Forward in Pennsylvania that is putting a priority in learning spaces and how they're understanding how it impacts learning. research. This is a brain. We could go back to like Vygotsky and social learning and those types of things and how it impacts learning. And so we have various ideas on how do we plan for things like movement? How do we plan for social catalytic relationship building things? One of the examples we quote is a now superintendent, was a principal at the time, Glenn Robbins in New Jersey. I had the opportunity to tour Glenn's old building when he was a principal. And one of the things he said that stuck with me is, Tom, I want every my building to be a learning space. And I just loved that, because we often think about, as we talk about in the book, Alfie Cohen uses the term the cells and bells model, the 900 square foot classroom that's completely aligned to 30 kids, desks and rows environment. How do we shift that to one that is more personal in nature? We just give a couple really quick examples of things that aren't financially driven, that we're pretty oblivious to, that we call out in the book, that yet from a brain research end totally impact learning. Here's a couple of them. Number one, taking a look at what do the symbols around the classroom and the school represent. So if, for instance, I'm teaching US history or US social studies, to pick on that for a moment, and every symbol of success around my classroom is a white male, multiple have indicated that females and our students of color will that and internalize, be successful, I have to be a white male. That's it doesn't cost much money, but we've got to be understanding of. So do the symbols of success around a classroom, are they representative of both genders? Are they representative of the culture or of your community as well? Let me give another quick one. When you walk into a classroom, and I believe one of these also comes from one of the same studies Eric was just referring to. When you walk in, I remember going back and being an elementary principal and thinking of maybe my first or second grade teachers, and I would walk into their classroom, and by the way, they were great teachers doing great things, but when I walked into that classroom, every square inch of the walls was covered in every single thing they had done that year, and I was bobbing and weaving around the classroom from all the things hanging from the ceiling. I didn't think a whole lot of that as an elementary principal. I thought they were creating really safe environments, but research shows an environment that kids that are distracted will be distracted about 17% longer, and kids will be on the whole distracted about 17% more of the time. Why? It's kind of common sense. There's so much stuff to look. And so if we're not using the stuff for learning, doesn't serve us. And that's where we get into, this isn't about decorating. This isn't about making it look pretty. This is all about the brain research side of it and making sure that we can do that. So those are two really quick examples that aren't financially driven. We get into things like daylight and the impact of daylight on mood, the impact of colors on the brain, and then how those kinds of things then impact mood, which then impact learning receptors in the brain, and then the ability for the brain to learn. That's what learning spaces are about, not being pretty for Pinterest.
Awesome. You know what, guys? We have so many questions left, and you guys have given us so many great tidbits of, information. Of one of the people on Twitter called it a call to action. Like, what are you doing to make this happen in your schools? So much great stuff has just happened in this conversation. So I really appreciate you guys taking time for this conversation. But I want to ask you one more question, and this might be a really long answer, so keep it short. What's next? What are some goals that you guys have for this upcoming year?
Well, I think it's tough to say what the goals are for the upcoming year. I mean, I think for me at least, and I think Tom would agree, how can we begin to have a more serious conversation, taking in the theory and the ideas that we're discussing, especially in social spaces, and really make concerted efforts to change teaching, learning, and leadership. And I think that if we can have more conversations about that and showcase more concrete examples, when I speak, I'd say 9 out of 10 times, leaders, administrators, and teachers alike are like, Eric, I want to do this, but my community wants to know how, is this going to improve achievement? And I hate talking about it, but, because again, we want to be innovative. We want to do agency. We want to be flexible, all this great stuff. But I think going back to the conversation that we've had, we can now really marry, Michael Fullan talks about new pedagogies, and his new pedagogies is where technology is a ubiquitous component of everything that we do when appropriate. And if we really focus on, and I love this quote by William Horton, if we don't get instructional design right first, all technology is going to do is speed up the rate of failure. Same thing with innovative ideas that, make for great quotes and talks, but aren't really changing anything. So I think my goal for this year is, how can we share more portfolios that are aligned to standards? How can we share more examples of quality assessments that we can embrace and use no matter where our schools? How can we show how schools that are dealing, that are in low socioeconomic areas are able to find innovative ways and improve the achievement gap? So I think it really comes down to, how can we keep showing examples of substance that people can rally around and really begin to implement change at scale.
Really well said there, Eric. And I'll just end with, I guess, my goals moving forward would be on a professional end, from the notes of all the work that we're doing with Future Ready Schools. We have the opportunity, we're doing we do about 8 free institutes between now and the end of the year, free for school leaders, encourage people to come to that. So my goal is not the event itself. My goal is to help continue to push thinking for admin, but also with that, grounding it in relationships. One of the things, we can talk about ed tech, we can talk about connectivity, we can talk about even leadership. Relationships are the heart and soul of what we do, and we can never forget we're here to serve children first, and our job is first and foremost is to love. And so one of my main goals is to always come back to, we can talk about everything else, but we need to focus on the whole child, loving that kid for being that kid, and doing everything we can to help them move forward. So that's kind of the professional goal, is to not ever lose sight of the work going on in buildings and day to day, not forget where I came from, but never forget about the kid first. My traveling a whole lot. I've been, just like Eric, flying virtually every week coast to coast, and own children, and Eric and I both value being dad first and foremost to our kids. So on a personal note, making sure that I do the time with my family and with kids, and not forgetting about the process of flying around and doing all this work. It's to put in that regard and letting man be second.
Thanks, guys. Colin, you going to wrap it up, or you want me to, buddy?
It looks like you might be frozen a little bit. Are you there, Colin?
Yeah, go ahead, Dan. Wrap her up.
Okay, so we want to share a couple of resources with you. Again, find Eric on Twitter at @E_Sheninger. And then also check out his blog website, ericsheninger.com. And then also you can find Tom on Twitter at Thomas C. Murray. And his website blog is at thomascmurray.com. And again, thank you guys so much for your time tonight. It's such a passionate conversation and so many good takeaways grounded in evidence, which I think, as you both know, is a hugely missing component to all of this work. It's fantastic. So we really appreciate you guys. Thank you so much. So we are going to share a couple of events coming up this next week here. The School Administrators of Iowa Conference is August 2nd and 3rd in Des Moines. And followers, we will be having a special Iowa EdChat live show on August 2nd, 8 o'clock in the morning. We're going to stream that. And you'll want to check out our Iowa EdChat hashtag, and also the hashtag of the conference, which is hashtag SAICONF17. Also coming up, Iowa City Summit featuring Google. That'll be at the New Liberty High School, August 7th and 8th. Coming up, Stacy Beamer is a contact. You can contact her on Twitter at @sbeamer, or Matt Degner at MW on Twitter with questions. And if you have regional or national events coming up, get a hold of us. We will get them out on our show. And Andrea, why don't you bring us home?
All right, guys. Thanks, everybody, for being here with us tonight and sharing your thoughts on Iowa EdChat Live. Always the last Sunday of every month. It's always great learning with all of you. And a very special thank you to our guests, Tom Murray and Eric Sheninger. Thanks to the rest of our Iowa EdChat team, Colin Wicken and Dan Butler. Be sure to also follow some of the new friends you met here tonight on the Iowa IAedChat hashtag and visit the IAedChat hashtag to continue the conversation. We're going to be back next week with another great topic. Until next time, be the change.